We'd been married for a good number of years. From the start, I've always been the kind of guy who's pretty firm in what I believe, especially when it comes to the values I was raised on. I've always thought that certain things, like stability, should stay constant. For me, it wasn't just a concept, it was a way of life. I knew what I wanted, and I figured my wife and I were on the same page. But the truth is, she was always more adventurous than I was. She had this way of gravitating toward anything new or unusual, while I preferred keeping things the way they were. On the surface, she seemed like the perfect partner, caring, smart, and definitely attractive. But after a while, I started noticing little things about her, things that became harder to ignore as time went on. She was always a people person, loved to talk and keep up with the neighbors and her coworkers. Honestly, there were moments when I thought she got a little too involved in those conversations, but I brushed it off. At the time, our relationship seemed strong. We could talk about anything, and I had no reason not to trust her. But as the years passed, it became clear that something was missing for her. She seemed restless, like the everyday routine was weighing on her. I told myself it was just a phase, that it would pass. I was working long hours, focusing on my career, leaving early in the morning and coming home late. Maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe the distance had crept in without me even realizing it. But I figured that's just how it is. I'm the one bringing in the money, and she should appreciate that. We didn't argue much, and from the outside, everything looked fine. But her behavior started raising questions. She became more distant, especially in recent months, and showed interest in things that I couldn't quite understand. At the time, I didn't pay it much attention. I thought maybe she was just bored or going through a phase, but our marriage seemed stable enough, and I trusted her. I always believed we shared the same values, that we had the same foundation. But looking back, I realized that I didn't know her as well as I thought I did. When we first started dating, I noticed pretty quickly that my wife had some, let's say, unusual preferences in the bedroom. It's not like I was completely naive, but she definitely had interests that caught me off guard. She was much more adventurous than I expected, especially for someone who seemed so composed in her day-to-day life. At first, it was kind of exciting, though I didn't fully understand how deep this side of her ran. I remember this one time, not long after we moved in together, I accidentally opened her laptop. She had left the browser open, and I saw a bunch of searches for things I hadn't even heard of. There were all kinds of weird gadgets and practices that looked like scenes out of a strange movie. At first, I just laughed it off, thinking it was some random curiosity. I mean, who hasn't Googled something out of the ordinary once or twice, right? But then I started noticing more and more of those searches popping up. The more I paid attention, the more obvious it became that this wasn't just a one-time thing. Every now and then, I'd see a glimpse of her search history or find a book lying around with titles that made me raise an eyebrow. She didn't hide it, but she wasn't exactly eager to talk about it either. It was just there, this part of her that was quietly lurking in the background. At first, it wasn't a problem. I mean, everyone has their quirks. One incident that sticks out was when we were still dating, and she suggested we try some role-playing scenario to spice things up. I was skeptical but figured I'd humor her. She got all into it, setting up this elaborate scene. Honestly, it was more hilarious than sexy. I remember standing there in this ridiculous costume, trying not to laugh as she gave me instructions. It was so far removed from my world that I knew right then we were wired very differently when it came to intimacy. Still, I went along with it for a while because she seemed genuinely excited. I figured if it made her happy and wasn't harming anyone, why not? But the deeper we went into this, the more I realized it wasn't for me. I'm a simple guy. I like things to be straightforward. All the extra layers of adventure just weren't necessary for me. Eventually, I had to put my foot down. Enough was enough. After a while, she stopped bringing it up as often, but I could tell that side of her was still very much alive. It was like she was testing the waters with her comments here and there, gauging how I'd react. One time, she asked what I thought about some strange new thing she'd read about, and I told her straight up, why mess with something that works? I wasn't trying to shut her down, but it was clear we weren't on the same page. Over time, she stopped suggesting things as often, but I could still sense that part of her lurking in the background. She didn't push, but I knew it hadn't disappeared. There was always this part of her that was searching for something more. I guess I thought it was just a phase, something she'd grow out of. But looking back, I can see that those moments weren't just harmless quirks. They were glimpses into something bigger, something I didn't fully understand. One evening after dinner, my wife casually brought up a conversation she had with the neighbor's son. He had just come back home for the summer break, visiting his mom next door. She mentioned how they had talked for a while, and she seemed really impressed with how much he'd grown since turning 18. She said they'd never really spoken much before, but this time, they connected during their conversation, and he opened up to her about his life. I didn't think much of it at the time. Small talk with neighbors was just part of who she was. But as she kept talking about him, I noticed she wasn't just making casual conversation. She went on about this elaborate gift he had planned for his girlfriend. Something about a surprise he had arranged, coming back a day early and presenting her with some thoughtful, personalized gift. I wasn't really paying attention to the details. Probably a necklace or some framed photo, I figured, but what caught my attention was how much my wife seemed to admire it. Her face lit up when she talked about this gesture. It wasn't just the gift itself, it was the effort, the planning, the thoughtfulness behind it. She described it with this kind of enthusiasm that I hadn't seen in a while. What really struck me was the wistful look in her eyes when she said, "Sometimes life is missing those kinds of surprises." I could tell she wasn't just talking about the kid next door, she was hinting at something she wished for herself. It felt like one of those moments when a husband is supposed to pick up on the unspoken message, you know? I stored that comment away, figuring it was her way of asking for a bit more spontaneity. I wasn't exactly the most spontaneous guy, but I thought maybe I could plan something, even if it was just a small surprise, to show her I was still thinking about her. At the time, it didn't feel like a big deal, but I mentally filed it under things to do someday. Maybe I'd plan a weekend away or get her a small gift when the time was right. I thought it couldn't hurt to do something like that. She'd been dropping hints, and I figured a well-timed gesture might remind her that I still cared, even if I wasn't the romantic type. Later that night, I replayed the conversation in my head. It was odd because she wasn't usually one to get so caught up in other people's relationships. She was a practical person like me. But this story about the neighbor's son and his grand gesture seemed to hit her in a way I hadn't seen before. It made me wonder if, after all these years, she was craving something more, something a little different from our usual routine. I didn't bring it up again, and neither did she. But from that day on, I kept thinking about it. Maybe a surprise was exactly what she needed. I figured I'd do something when the time was right, something to show her that I still cared. I didn't see it as a warning sign, just a nudge to put a little more effort into our relationship. After that conversation about the neighbor's son, I started noticing that my wife was spending more time with the neighbors in general, especially the mom next door. It felt like every other day she was either outside chatting with her or popping over to their house for a visit. It caught me off guard because, before this, she had never shown much interest in them. We were always polite, of course. Wives say hello, but nothing more than that. Suddenly, she was acting like they were her new best friends. She kept mentioning how much she enjoyed talking to the neighbor. "They're such a great family," she'd say. "It's refreshing to talk to someone who really gets us. They're like us, just a little older." That threw me off. We had lived next to them for years, and I'd never thought much about their family dynamic. To me, they were just the neighbors, nothing more. But now, it seemed like my wife had found some kind of kindred spirit in the woman next door. She went on about how they had a lot in common, how the husband used to work in a similar field to mine before he retired, and how the wife shared many of my wife's interests. They were suddenly comparing notes on everything: parenting, relationships, even their pasts. What really got me was how much she talked about their son. She casually dropped comments here and there about how mature he had become, how he was so responsible for his age. "He's really got his head on straight," she'd say. I wasn't sure what to make of it. We didn't have kids of our own, so maybe she just admired their family setup. But hearing her praise the neighbor's son like that was strange to me. Why was she so invested in these people all of a sudden? It wasn't like her to get so close to someone so quickly. She was friendly, sure, but she usually kept people at a distance unless she really trusted them. Now, It seemed like she was becoming a regular part of their lives. And it wasn't just small talk anymore. She started sharing things about our own life, things about me, about us. She'd come home and tell me how she and the neighbor's wife had been discussing something we had just talked about days earlier, almost as if they were having an ongoing conversation about our marriage. I started feeling uneasy about it. It was like our private life was getting tangled up with theirs in a way I hadn't anticipated. She'd tell me how the neighbor's wife gave her advice, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that. I didn't like the idea of someone else having a window into our marriage, even if it was just through casual conversation. Then one day she said something that really stuck with me. They remind me of us, you know? Like they're us, but a little older and wiser. That hit me hard. I didn't see the connection at all. Sure, they lived next to us and maybe there were some surface similarities, but that's where it ended for me. I couldn't understand why she was drawing this parallel or why she suddenly felt so connected to them. I tried to brush it off as her just being social, maybe needing someone to talk to. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't say anything. I figured it wasn't worth making a fuss over. After all, what harm could a little neighborly friendship do? But the uneasiness lingered. One day at work, my boss pulled me aside to tell me there was a good chance I'd be sent on a business trip soon. It wasn't something that came out of the blue, I had been expecting it for a while. It would be about a week away, with a decent bonus attached, so I agreed right away. The extra money would be nice, and it would help us out with some of the bills, so it seemed like a win-win situation. That night when I got home, I told my wife about it. Looks like I might be going out of town for a bit, maybe a week or so, I said. To my surprise, she smiled and said, "Really? That's great." Her enthusiasm caught me off guard. I expected her to be a little more hesitant, maybe even a bit upset about me being gone for that long, but she seemed genuinely excited. She asked a few questions, where I'd be going, how long I'd be away, and I told her it wasn't confirmed yet but likely would be soon. She was all in, talking about how the extra pay would be great and how I'd been working hard, so this was a good opportunity. Then she said something that stuck with me. It'll be good timing too. I'll have some time to relax, maybe hang out with the neighbors more. We've been talking a lot lately, and it'll be nice to have some extra time to catch up. She smiled as she said it, and while I didn't think much of it at the time, I did find it a little odd how eager she seemed to spend time with them. Especially with the neighbor's son. I brushed it off, thinking she was just trying to fill her time while I was away. She wasn't usually the type to get lonely or complain about me being gone, so maybe this was her way of dealing with it. I didn't think there was any harm in her hanging out with the neighbors, though I did find it strange how often she'd been talking about them lately. As the days went on and the trip became more of a reality, my wife seemed more and more comfortable with the idea of me leaving. In fact, she didn't seem to be worried about it at all. She even joked about how she'd have the house to herself for a little while, free to do whatever she wanted. "I'll miss you, of course," she added with a grin, "but it'll be nice to have a little space." I laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to make light of the situation. But I couldn't help but notice that she brought up the neighbors, especially the son, more often in the days leading up to my trip. Every time the topic came up, she talked about how great it was to have them around, how much she enjoyed their company. It felt strange, but I didn't read too much into it. I trusted her. If she wanted to spend a little extra time with them while I was gone, what harm could there be in that? I figured the trip would be a good opportunity for both of us. I'd take care of business, earn a little extra cash, and maybe even plan something special for her when I got back. I had been thinking about that surprise for a while now, something thoughtful to show her I was paying attention. Little did I know, that trip would change everything. The day of the business trip finally arrived. I woke up early, packed my bags, and got ready to leave for the airport. My wife was up with me, helping me pack the last of my things and making sure I didn't forget anything. She seemed in a good mood, and that made things easier for me. I wasn't thrilled about being away from home for a week, but knowing she was fine with it helped me feel better. Before I left, she mentioned her plans for the week. "While you're gone, I'm going to take care of a few things I've been putting off," she said casually. "You know, just some stuff around the house. Maybe I'll meet up with the neighbors a few times to catch up." I nodded, not thinking much of it. She had mentioned them so much lately that I wasn't surprised she planned to spend more time with them. At least she'd have something to do while I was away, and I wouldn't come back to her complaining about being bored or lonely. We said our goodbyes and I headed out the door. On the way to the airport, I felt a weird mix of relief and anticipation. The trip would be a break from the routine, but I also couldn't wait to come back and surprise her. I imagined her reaction, picturing how happy she'd be when I showed her I had been thinking of her the whole time. Little did I know, the surprise was on me. The week of my business trip went smoothly. I called my wife every day, just to check in and see how things were going at home. She seemed fine, always cheerful, telling me about her day, what she and the neighbors were up to, and how she was keeping busy. Everything seemed normal at first. But after a couple of days, I started noticing something odd. Whenever I called between 4 o'clock and 6 p.m., she never picked up. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was running errands or visiting the neighbor again. People have their own schedules, right? But it happened consistently. Every day during those hours, she was unreachable. By the third day, it was impossible to ignore. The pattern was clear, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe she had just found a new routine while I was gone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But instead of confronting it, I focused on something else, planning that surprise for her. Since she wasn't available during those hours, I figured it was the perfect time to work on it without her knowing. I wanted to give her that unexpected moment she'd hinted at before, something that would make her feel appreciated. I started thinking about what I could do. Maybe a special dinner when I got back or a little gift. Something to show her I was thinking of her while I was away. It wasn't much, but I knew she'd appreciate the gesture. So, every day when 4 p.m. rolled around, I made a note of it, using that time to plan. In my head, I was building up this big, romantic surprise, convinced it would be the perfect way to show her I cared. Looking back, I realize how naive I was. While I was busy planning, something else was happening right under my nose, and I didn't see it. The end of the trip came faster than expected. My flight got in early, and I decided to surprise my wife by coming home a day ahead of schedule. I didn't tell her. I figured it would be fun to walk through the door and catch her off guard. In my head, I imagined her smiling, happy to see me, and we'd have a nice evening together. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw her car parked outside. It was the middle of the day, so I figured she must have decided to stay home that day. I parked the car and walked up to the front door quietly, excited to see her face when I came in. But as soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. The house was completely silent. No TV, no music, nothing. That wasn't like her. I called out, "Hey, I'm home," but there was no answer. I set my bags down and started walking through the house, assuming she was in the kitchen or the bedroom. That's when I heard a faint noise coming from upstairs. My stomach dropped as I made my way toward the stairs. Something wasn't right, but I tried to keep calm. As I climbed the stairs, the noise became clearer. Muffled movements, maybe? I called her name again, but still nothing. When I reached the bedroom door, it was slightly open. I pushed it, and the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. There she was, lying on the bed, naked and tied up. There was something inside her, a strange object, and I couldn't even process it in that moment. The scene felt surreal, like it wasn't even happening to me. For a few seconds, I just stood there, frozen in disbelief. Before I could even react, the bathroom door creaked open, and out stepped the neighbor's son. He was wrapped in nothing but a towel, his face as shocked as mine. Everything clicked in that moment. The constant mentions of him, the bonding with the neighbors, the missed phone calls. It all came crashing down on me like a tidal wave, and I couldn't believe I had been so blind. I didn't even think. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I lunged toward him, slapping him hard across the face. The sound echoed through the room, and he stumbled back, his towel slipping. "Get the hell out of my house!" I shouted, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. I wasn't in control. I was running purely on instinct, and I needed him gone. The kid didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his clothes and bolted out of the room, tripping over himself as he rushed for the door. I didn't care where he went, as long as he was out of my sight. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding, and my mind was racing. I could hardly process what I had just walked in on. My attention turned back to my wife. She was still lying there, tied up, looking vulnerable, but in that moment, I felt nothing but fury. A part of me wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but I knew nothing she said would make this any better. Instead, I walked over, grabbed a blanket and tossed it over her. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice barely controlled. She stammered, trying to explain. We were just experimenting." "Experimenting?" I spat the word out like it was poison. "With the neighbor's son? In our bed?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she tried to reach for me, but I pulled away. "You don't understand. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I shook my head, disbelief and disgust coursing through me. "You're going to try and justify this? This isn't some harmless experiment. This is betrayal. And you're sitting here like it's no big deal." Tears started to fall down her face, but I was too far gone to care. It was just, I felt so alone. He listened to me, he understood me. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "Understood you?" I shot back. "So, you went and did this? With him?" She tried to defend herself, telling me that she had been feeling neglected, that it was just a stupid mistake, that she didn't mean to hurt me. But none of it mattered. The damage was done. I had walked in on something that could never be undone, and no excuse was going to fix that. I started grabbing her clothes, her things, anything I could find that belonged to her. "You're going to get your stuff and get out," I said, my voice cold and distant. "I don't want to see you here when I get back." She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. "Please, let me explain. We can fix this. I'll do anything." But I was done. I had nothing left to give. "No," I said firmly. "There's nothing to fix. You made your choice. Now you're going to deal with the consequences." With that, I tossed the rest of her belongings into a pile and pointed to the door. "Get out." She hesitated for a moment, probably thinking I'd change my mind. But I didn't. I stood there, waiting for her to leave. Finally, she picked up her things and walked out, tears still streaming down her face. The house was eerily quiet after she left, and I just stood there, staring at the mess she had left behind. I couldn't believe this was my life now. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage had been shattered in an instant. After a while, I grabbed my phone and called my best friend. "I'm getting a divorce," I said flatly, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. He listened as I poured out the whole story, his voice full of sympathy and support. It felt good to talk to someone, to let out the rage and disbelief that had been boiling inside me since I walked through that door. In the days that followed, I started the process of ending my marriage. There was no going back after what had happened. I met with a lawyer, filed the papers, and tried to focus on getting through each day. My wife, now soon-to-be ex-wife, kept trying to reach out. She sent texts, left voicemails, begging me to reconsider. But I couldn't. The trust was gone, and without it, there was nothing left to save. The divorce process wasn't easy. There were painful conversations, legal battles, and a lot of anger. But every step I took toward closing that chapter of my life made me feel just a little bit stronger. I knew I was doing the right thing, even if it hurt. In the months that followed, I started to rebuild. I threw myself into work, spent time with friends, and slowly began to feel like myself again. The pain didn't disappear overnight, but I learned how to live with it. And eventually, I found a sense of peace in knowing that I had made the right decision to walk away. One day, months after everything had settled, I got a text from her. It was short, simple, "I hope you're doing well." For a moment, I felt a pang of something, maybe sadness, maybe regret. But then I realized I was doing well, better than I had in a long time. I had moved on. And as far as I was concerned, that chapter of my life was closed for good. In the end, her betrayal had taught me a hard lesson about trust, one I wouldn't forget. But it also gave me the chance to rebuild my life, to find something better. And as I looked forward to the future, I knew I was ready to embrace whatever came next. I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of you for watching my videos, sharing them, and supporting me along the way. Your views, comments, and likes are the driving force behind my passion to create captivating and unexpected stories. Every tale I share is more than just a plot. It's a journey of emotions, lessons, and reflections that we experience together. Your engagement brings life and soul to this channel. Thank you for sticking with me until the very end of each video because the finale of every story is where the real impact lies. I promise to continue delivering twists and turns that surprise, inspire, and resonate with your hearts.